David Reed was basically zoning out so hard, he might as well have been a statue while Professor Healyth, his four-armed teacher, rambled on about interstellar quarantine rules. The professor paced in front of a glowing star chart, and all around David, students from a dozen different star systems were scribbling away furiously, their various eyes and limbs glued to the lecture. It had been 3 months since he'd arrived, the very first human in the exchange program, and the sheer strangeness of it all still boggled his mind. To his left sat LRA, a bug-like being whose huge, iridescent eyes seemed to shimmer with an insatiable curiosity. Behind him, a massive guy named Bront made his custom-built chair creak and groan under his sheer bulk. And sitting right across from him was Scylla, whose gills pulsed gently behind a special hydrating mask. "Next week," Professor Healyth announced, tapping the hologram with a long, slender finger, "you will all be taking the practical final exam for your xenobiology certification." You could practically feel the anxiety spike in the room. For the first time all day, David actually perked up. A hands-on test? Now that sounded way more interesting than another lecture. "This is a standardized exam administered at every galactic academy," the professor went on. "You'll be put into simulated environments to evaluate your survival instincts and biological knowledge." They all saw him as this delicate little thing from some forgotten, dangerous planet. They had no clue what they were about to unleash. "You're going to want to stick around for this, because this is where everything changes." LRA leaned over and whispered, "Have you ever taken a test like this before?" David just gave a little shrug. "Back on Earth, I was a paramedic. We did emergency simulations all the time. It's no big deal." Instantly, a bunch of students snapped their heads in his direction, giving each other these strange looks, having some kind of silent chat that he was definitely not a part of. Professor Healyth's mandibles clicked, which David had learned was her version of a smile. "The exam is perfectly safe. We've been running these simulations for more than 300 years without a single incident. The scenarios are meant to be a minor challenge, not a genuine danger." "What kind of challenges?" Bront's deep voice boomed from behind him. "Things like sudden temperature changes, shifts in the atmosphere, resource management, and monitoring your own physiological stress," the professor explained. "Nothing that any species capable of spaceflight shouldn't be able to manage." For the first time since he'd gotten to this academy, David was actually pumped. He'd spent 2 years as an EMT in New Jersey before this, so he knew a thing or two about staying calm when everything was going sideways. A controlled test inside a lab? Honestly, it sounded like a walk in the park. "You will each be given basic supplies," the professor continued. "Water, nutrient packs, a first aid kit, and an emergency beacon. The difficulty will ramp up over time, but you can end the test at any moment with no academic penalty. You are graded against your own species' biological baseline, so this is not a competition." Scylla raised a webbed hand. "How long does it usually take?" "Anywhere from 1 to 2 standard days, depending on your approach. Some finish quickly, others are more methodical. There is no time limit," Professor Healyth answered, her gaze sweeping across the class. "Let me be perfectly clear. This is a routine part of your education. Thousands upon thousands of students successfully pass this exam every single year." "Will we be in there alone?" LRA asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes. Isolation is the only way to get an accurate measure of your individual stress response. But rest assured, you will be monitored constantly, and a medical team is always on standby." The professor paused. "Any other questions?" David put his hand up. "Do we need to bring anything?" "No. All necessary equipment is provided. Simply arrive at the testing facility tomorrow at sunrise wearing comfortable attire," she said, her antenna giving a strange little twitch of curiosity as she looked at him. "I trust the human delegation has approved your participation?" "Yep, they signed off on it," David said. He'd barely glanced at the forms he'd signed. The human coordinator had just told him it was standard academic stuff, and honestly, David had been more worried about his upcoming star navigation quiz. As the class began to pack up, David grabbed his datapad and started for the exit. LRA scurried over to block his path. "David," she whispered, looking around to make sure no one could overhear them. "I have to ask you something." "Sure, LRA, what's on your mind?" Her massive, compound eyes were fixed on him with a new and unsettling intensity. "Is it true, what they whisper about your world?" David casually leaned against the wall. "And what exactly are they whispering?" "Well," she stammered, "the official record's listed as a Class 12 Deathworld, but the scuttlebutt is that the classification doesn't even scratch the surface." David couldn't help but chuckle, or maybe it's not as bad as everyone thinks. "I mean, yeah, we've got some wild weather and a few big predators, but humans have been kicking around on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. We're pretty resilient." "Resilient," LRA repeated softly. "Yes, I imagine you'd have to be." She reached out a delicate limb and gently touched his arm. "Just please be careful tomorrow, David. Even routine procedures can have unexpected outcomes." "Hey, don't you worry about me, I'll be fine," David replied with a confident grin. "How tough can it really be?" As he strolled back to his dorm, David was completely oblivious to how the other students practically leaped out of his path, and he totally missed the profound look of concern on LRA's face as she watched him disappear down the hall. The testing center was a massive, sterile white labyrinth of corridors and observation decks. David followed the signs to his assigned room, passing other students who all looked sick with anxiety. A lanky medical technician with far too many joints in its arms greeted him at the door. "David Reed, the human?" "That's me." The technician's eye stalks rotated, giving him a full head-to-toe scan. "Astonishing. Truly astonishing. Please, proceed into Chamber 17. Your equipment is inside." The room was a small 10 by 10 foot cube with blank white walls that could project any environment imaginable. A simple cot sat in the middle, with a shelf next to the door holding his supplies. He had 3 bottles of water, a box of protein bars, a medical kit, and a small device with a large red emergency button. David took a seat on the cot and waited. A calm, automated voice echoed from a hidden speaker. "Examination commencing. Phase 1, thermal regulation. Please remain calm and seated." The temperature inside the room started to slowly creep up. David took off his jacket. After a couple of minutes, the air went from warm to hot, reminding him of a typical summer day back in New Jersey. He was so unfazed that he pulled out his datapad and opened up a novel he'd been wanting to finish. After about 20 minutes, the temperature capped out. David hardly noticed. He was used to those humid, sticky East Coast summers where it felt like you were breathing soup. This dry heat was actually a nice change of pace, but up in the observation center 3 floors above, Professor Healyth was staring at David's vital signs in absolute disbelief. The temperature in Chamber 17 was now at a point that would trigger severe distress in nearly every species on record. Yet David's heart rate was chilling at a cool 68 beats per minute. His breathing was relaxed and even. He was just sitting there, casually reading a book. "Are you 100% certain these monitors are calibrated correctly?" Professor Healyth demanded of the tech. "Yes, Professor. All systems are nominal. The human, he appears to be completely at ease." Meanwhile, in the chamber next door, Scylla had already smashed her emergency button as the arid air began to make her skin crack. 2 doors down, the colossal Bront was panting heavily, his massive frame struggling to shed the heat. David just swiped to the next page on his datapad, totally absorbed in his story. Then, the calm voice returned. "Phase 2, atmospheric adjustment. Please continue to breathe as you normally would." The air suddenly felt a bit thinner, like being at a high altitude. He'd gone hiking in Colorado once and remembered needing to take slightly deeper breaths. His body adjusted on instinct, without a single conscious thought. "Huh," he murmured to himself. "Feels like Denver in here." In the observation room, red alerts began flashing across the main console. The oxygen level in David's chamber had just been reduced by 15%, a drop that should have triggered immediate respiratory distress. "His O2 sats are still at 97%, the technician shrieked, its voice crackling with pure shock. "That is not possible in this atmosphere." Professor Helleth frantically pulled up David's file. It was brief. Homeworld, Earth, classification, Class 12, Deathworld, standard sea level atmospheric pressure 101.3 kilopascals, oxygen concentration 21%. She stared at the screen, utterly convinced the system had to be malfunctioning. But the data was correct. The very air humans considered normal was basically a toxic poison to most other life forms in the galaxy. That high-octane, oxygen-rich air David was used to would cause a Xylotian's cells to literally corrode from the inside. By lowering the oxygen by 15%, they hadn't created a challenge for him. They'd accidentally created the perfect 5-star luxury environment by galactic standards. So what happens when you take a guy from a planet everyone dismisses as a joke and put him in the galaxy's most grueling academic test? You're seeing it happen in real time, and trust me, you won't believe how this ends. It all became clear with test number 3, the low-pressure simulation. A calm voice announced the change, and as other students began gasping for air, David simply felt his ears pop. He let out a little yawn to clear them and went right back to his book, completely unaware that he was rewriting the definition of tough. It all started the moment this human, David, let out a simple yawn. Across the hall, in Chamber 9, a lanky student from a low-gravity world just collapsed. The kid's body couldn't handle the pressure change from David's yawn, but instead of showing concern, the head examiner, Professor Helleth, saw an opportunity. She wanted to prove that humans didn't belong in her academy, and she was about to stack the deck so high it would touch the stars. If you've ever felt like the whole world was testing you, stick around, because you're about to meet someone who was literally being tested by the galaxy, and they had no idea who they were messing with. "Put him on the advanced protocols," she commanded, her voice like ice. A 4-eyed technician almost fell off his stool. "Professor, with all due respect, those are designed for species from lethal environment worlds. That's not a fair test." "I am well aware of what the test is for," she snapped back, leaving no room for argument. "Do it." But down in the testing chamber, David just flipped a page in his book, stretched his arms, and thought that this whole thing was a lot less stressful than a quiet Tuesday night back in the ER. He was honestly starting to wonder if they forgot he was in there. Announcing the next scenario, a computerized voice chimed. "Environmental irritant exposure. This portion of the exam is optional. You may decline without penalty." "Nah, I'm game," David yelled up at the ceiling. "Let's rock and roll." A second later, a fine mist filled the room, smelling like a nasty cocktail of bleach and pepper spray. His eyes watered a bit, and he let out a huge sneeze, followed by another one. "Whew, that's got some kick," he chuckled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Smells a bit like the stuff we used to clean the trauma bay." But behind the one-way glass, every single monitor was flashing bright red. The atmospheric toxins were at a concentration that should have caused instant respiratory failure in most species. Instead, David just sneezed a third time and mumbled about wishing he could crack a window. All 4 of Professor Helleth's eyes were wide as dinner plates as she stared at the data streaming in. David's biology wasn't just resisting the poisons, it was actively neutralizing them on contact, poisons that would kill almost any other creature in the galaxy. He had a case of the sniffles, but his lung capacity was a perfect 100%. The terrified technician leaned over and whispered, "Professor, what in the seven systems is he?" Professor Helleth had no answer. The only thing she could think was that labeling planet Earth a Class 12 hazard zone might have been the biggest understatement in galactic history. She slammed her hand on the console and called an emergency meeting with the Academy Director and the coordinator for the Human Exchange Program. The three of them sat in a sterile, soundproof room, rewatching the footage of David casually walking through every nightmare scenario they threw at him. "We have to stop this," said Director Prass, his crystalline form practically vibrating with anxiety. "This human is operating completely outside of all predictable models." The human coordinator, a sharp woman named Rachel Kim, just smirked. "He volunteered for every test, and according to your own data, his vital signs are perfect." "That's precisely the problem," Professor Helleth shot back, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "Your species has tolerances that make our most extreme challenges look like a day at the beach. We designed these tests using data from 3,000 species across 1,200 worlds. David is treating life or death situations like they're a minor inconvenience." Rachel leaned back and crossed her arms. "Earth can be a tough place. You either learn to adapt or you end up as part of the fossil record." "Your planet is a Class 12 death world," Director Prass exclaimed. 98% of all known species would need a full environmental suit just to breathe what you people call fresh air." "So what you're saying is David is acing the exam," Rachel said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm still failing to see the problem." Professor Helleth furiously pulled up a new chart. "This shows David's stress hormone levels compared to the average applicant. Notice anything unusual?" Rachel gave it a quick look. While every other applicant's line shot up like a rocket, David's was so flat it looked like a glitch. "He's calm," she stated. "Isn't that a good thing?" "He shouldn't be calm. He should be in a state of complete physiological collapse." The professor pointed to another screen, the toxin screening. "At that concentration, his entire nervous system should be shutting down. Instead," David sneezed. "Humans sneeze when something tickles their nose," Rachel explained slowly, as if talking to a child. "It's a protective reflex." "Protective," Director Prass echoed, the word sounding foreign. "Yes. I'm beginning to believe your definition of protective and ours are two entirely different concepts." Despite their fears, they agreed to let the exam continue, but under the strictest supervision. They gave David one last chance to back out, telling him the next part would be incredibly difficult. He just laughed. "Honestly, this is all pretty fascinating," he said to a camera on the ceiling. "It's the most thorough physical I've ever gotten." The next test was a simulated battlefield injury. They presented him with a hyper-realistic prosthetic arm that had a gruesome gash on it, along with a standard-issue first aid kit. The goal was to test a student's reaction to severe trauma. Most applicants turned green just looking at the fake limb. In fact, a huge percentage of the students refused to even touch it. But David, the former EMT, walked right up to it like he was clocking in for a shift. "All right, let's see what we've got. First rule, stop the bleed," he mumbled, completely unaware that his every word was being recorded. "Direct pressure, elevate the limb, no arterial spray, that's a good sign. Next, we got to clean it out, make sure no debris gets in there. Oh, neat, this kit has antiseptic wipes, now we wrap it, snug but not so tight you cut off circulation." He had the entire thing patched up in under 4 minutes. The galactic average for the handful of students who didn't faint was 18 minutes. "He's narrating the procedure," Professor Helleth whispered, her voice filled with a strange mix of horror and awe. "He's teaching advanced trauma care, while he's supposed to be in a state of shock," she said, completely baffled. "David worked in an emergency room on Earth," Rachel explained quietly. "This is literally what he did for a living." "Your people train their civilians for things like this?" the director asked, completely stunned. We train a lot of people for a lot of things, Rachel said. On Earth, you never know when you'll need to save a life. That one sentence hung in the air with the weight of a collapsing star. A species that saw so much trauma, they taught advanced first aid like it was simple arithmetic. A world so dangerous that patching up a horrifying wound was considered basic common sense. They had to see more. The next test was food deprivation. After only 18 hours, most of the other students were showing signs of a major physical and mental breakdown. By the 40-hour mark, several had to be medically evacuated. David, on the other hand, just mentioned that he sometimes gets so busy at the hospital he forgets to eat lunch. And then he politely asked if they had any more books he could read. His body was casually running on energy reserves developed by a species that used to hunt by chasing its prey until the animal literally died of exhaustion. What is the maximum time a human can survive without food? Director Prass asked Rachel, his voice barely a whisper. It depends on the person. But with water, a healthy adult can go for a few weeks, maybe more. We're pretty efficient. A few weeks? Professor Helleth choked out, looking absolutely horrified. The majority of known species begin to suffer total organ failure after 5 to 7 days. Yeah, we're tough to get rid of, Rachel said with a hint of pride. It's kind of our thing. Just then, across campus, another student named Laura had managed to hack the live observation feed. She watched, mesmerized, as David's impossible stats rolled across her screen, making her own top-of-the-class scores from last year look like a child's scribbles. The numbers simply didn't add up. Imagine being so resilient that a place officially classified as an extreme hazard zone is your idea of a spa day. That was David. He was just hanging out in environments their safety charts labeled categorically unsurvivable, and his vital signs were as steady as a rock. When the alien administrator, Elara, looked up the official galactic file on planet Earth, she couldn't believe what she was reading. It was a Class 12 Deathworld. The file was a horror story. Savage predators, chaotic weather, constant tectonic instability, crushing gravity, brutal solar radiation, and a biosphere teeming with more deadly microorganisms than a high-level bioweapons facility. And these creatures, these humans, had the audacity to call this nightmare home. They didn't just survive there. They had picnics on fault lines. They built sprawling cities on a planet that seemed to be actively trying to kill them. They had evolved to see a living hell as just a regular Tuesday. Laura thought about David's friendly smile and how he was always the first person to offer help to the other students. This being, who was forged in a furnace that would vaporize her in minutes, was genuinely one of the kindest people she had ever met. Laura closed the files and sat in the dark for a long time, just trying to process what it meant for humanity to finally join the galactic community. Meanwhile, back in the observation room, the senior staff had gathered for the final and most brutal test. Professor Helleth had insisted on the pain tolerance exam, even though Director Prass had argued fiercely against it. The data is simply too valuable to ignore, she had insisted. It is a standard part of the advanced protocol. We administer controlled electrical pulses of increasing intensity. Most species tap out at level 3. Level 5 is considered unbearable. She keyed in the command, a cruel smile on her face, fully expecting the human to finally break. They said level 7 would break my mind. They told me that in the whole history of their fancy galactic academy, no one had ever made it past level 8. And honestly, if you want to see how a regular guy from Earth makes an entire station of super advanced aliens question everything they thought they knew, you're going to want to stick around for this. Down in the test chamber, I sat patiently with a bunch of electrodes stuck to my arm. An automated voice told me I could say stop at any time. Yeah, right. The final trial was about to start. "Ready when you are!" I shouted up with a big, goofy grin. Level 1 kicked in. It felt like a tiny zap of static, the kind you get from a fuzzy blanket. I told them I could feel it, but my heart rate didn't even twitch. Level 2 was a sharper jolt, like touching a hot pan for a split second. Still nothing. My pulse was as steady as a rock. Then came Level 3, the exact point where pretty much every other species in the known universe starts screaming for their mom. Can you imagine getting hit with pain so intense it would make a hardened soldier cry, only for you to think it's kinda annoying? For me, it just felt like part of a checkup. I frowned a little. "Okay, that's a bit uncomfortable," I said, "but it's not awful. I'd give it a 4 out of 10. The alien staff just gawked at each other, totally stunned. My jaw tightened a bit, but quitting wasn't even a thought in my head. "Proceeding to Level 5, the technician announced, his voice shaky. This was the level designed to cause serious distress in basically every known life form. I just took a long, slow breath. "Yep, definitely feeling that one," I said with a nod. "Feels like a really bad Charlie horse." Professor Helleth, the one in charge, leaned in, her 4 eyes glued to the monitors. The pain signals were definitely lighting up my nervous system. My brain was getting the message loud and clear, but my body's stress response was basically asleep, and I was asking for more. "Level 6, Lieutenant Sassone." The technician said, glancing nervously at the professor. She gave a sharp nod. A small hiss of pain escaped my lips. "Okay, yep, that one's got some kick," I chuckled. "Reminds me of the time I snapped my finger playing basketball back in high school." The director, a guy named Pratt, looked like he was about to throw up. "You suffered a compound fracture, and you kept playing a game?" From the observation deck, another human, Rachel, just smirked. "You tape it up, man. It's just a finger." We were only on level 7. Now, this level was literally classified as torture under most galactic laws. Some planets even used it as a way to say goodbye to their worst criminals. A thin layer of sweat popped up on my forehead, and I gritted my teeth, but I didn't say the word. "Hey, are you sure this machine is working right?" I asked, my voice a little strained. "I mean, don't get me wrong, it stings, but the way you all hyped it up, I was expecting a lot more." The whole room of alien scientists went dead silent. The human was asking if their torture machine was broken. "The equipment is functioning within normal parameters," a technician finally choked out. Do you want to proceed to level 8? "Might as well," I shrugged. "Let's see what this thing's got." The indicator light flashed. My hand squeezed into a fist so tight my knuckles turned white. My breath caught in my throat. And for the first time, they saw pure, unfiltered pain on my face. I held on for a full 10 seconds before letting out a sharp breath. "All right. Yeah, that's a tough one. I think I'm good. You guys should have all the data you need from that, right?" Professor Helleth didn't even realize she'd been holding her breath. I had just willingly sat through an agony that would make a battle-hardened Krogan pass out, and I didn't stop because I couldn't take it. I stopped because I thought they had what they needed. The temperature trials were next. They dropped the chamber to a cold that should have frozen me solid almost instantly. Instead, my body just started to shiver. This weird, automatic thing where my muscles spasmed to make their own heat. I said it was chilly, but I was fine. The heat tests were pretty much the same story. I just started to sweat, tiny drops of water appearing on my skin to cool me down. The alien students who watched the recording later were completely baffled. Their species had to change the environment around them to stay warm or cool. Humans, apparently, just leaked. "That is profoundly disturbing," a student named Sila whispered to her friend Laura. "They secrete fluids." "They don't leak," Laura corrected her, though she was just as freaked out. It's a biological thermoregulation process, and a ridiculously efficient one at that. The last part of the exam was all about endurance. They just had me do simple stuff until I collapsed. Walking, climbing, lifting. Basic things. For the first hour, he barely broke a sweat. By the second, the alien staff watching him were looking exhausted. After 3 straight hours on the endurance machine, David was drenched, but he wasn't even close to his limit. "Hey, just wondering if there's a time limit on this thing?" he called out, his breathing perfectly steady. "'Cause I can do this all day if you need more data." Professor Helleth just gaped at the readouts. David's muscles were firing on all cylinders, but he was nowhere near hitting a wall. His heart and lungs were in overdrive, yet they maintained a rhythm he could sustain for many more hours. His entire body was a finely tuned machine, perfected by evolution to outlast its prey over incredible distances. "You can cease the physical assessment now, David," Professor Helleth announced, his voice tight. "We have an abundance of data." David hopped off the machine and immediately began a series of cool-down stretches. "Great," he said with a grin. "That was a pretty good warm-up. So do you guys have a gym or a weight room on the station? I'm trying to stick to my schedule." The very idea of deliberately putting your body through hell for some kind of health benefit was so completely bizarre to them that several of the observers had to have it explained over and over again. "Humans intentionally create tiny tears in their muscle fibers so they grow back stronger," Rachel explained calmly. "We constantly push our cardiovascular systems to their limits to make them more efficient. We call it training." "Your species has weaponized self-harm as a form of routine maintenance," Director Prass said, looking a little pale. Rachel just grinned. "We call it getting jacked." I was sent to recover. My scans showed minor muscle inflammation, thousands of microscopic tears that were already healing. My healing rate was, unbelievably, faster than any species they had on record. It was like my immune system was so aggressive, so used to dealing with constant damage, that it was always on high alert. While I took a break, Professor Heath wrote her first report. The human hadn't just passed their standards. I didn't just break their records, I made their records look like a complete and utter joke. I treated their toughest tests like a minor inconvenience, and I stayed polite and cheerful the whole time. Earth wasn't a Class 12 death world, it was in a category all by itself, and humanity was its terrifying masterpiece. I was in the debriefing room, sipping water and filling out a survey. I rated most of the tests as moderately difficult, and wrote that the pain simulator was interesting, but not much worse than a really tough leg day at the gym. Professor Helleth walked in to go over the results when suddenly the entire station erupted with alarms and flashing red lights. A calm, robotic voice announced from the ceiling, "Containment failure detected in the xenobiology laboratory. All personnel, please initiate lockdown procedures. Hazardous material teams, report to Section 7. The door to our room hissed shut, its heavy magnetic lock slamming into place with a solid thud. Through the reinforced window, I could see students and professors running and screaming in absolute terror. Professor Helleth's antenna shot straight up in sheer panic. "How bad is this containment breach?" I asked, my own emergency training kicking in instantly. "I don't know," she stuttered, her voice trembling. "The xenobiology lab holds creatures from incredibly hostile worlds. Some are weaponized diseases, others are apex predators." She scrambled over to the comms panel. "We should be safe in here. This room is completely airtight." Just then, a heavy grinding noise echoed from the walls, followed by a long hiss. The station's massive ventilation system clanked to a halt. "That can't be good," I said flatly. Professor Helleth was frantically checking the room's life support monitors, her mandibles chattering in fear. The breach just took out life support. We're losing heat. The air recyclers are offline. As she spoke, I felt the air change. The delicate atmospheric mix designed for dozens of different species was falling apart. To make things worse, right before the vents died, the escaped creature had pumped a huge cloud of toxic spores directly into the system. All across the station, aliens started to choke. A giant creature named Bront crashed to the floor in the hallway, his massive body unable to handle the sudden cold. Silas started gasping for breath as all the moisture was sucked from the air. One by one, the station's inhabitants began collapsing in an environment that had suddenly turned into poison. I quickly took stock of the situation. My room was fine for now, but I could see people dropping like flies right outside my door. Lara stumbled past, her big, beautiful compound eyes already starting to glaze over as she fought for air. "Can you open this door?" I asked the professor. "Absolutely not," Heath shot back. "Whatever is out there could kill us in seconds. We have to wait for the hazmat teams." "And how long is that going to take?" he demanded. "They have to figure out what they're up against, get suited up, and map out their entry. Maybe 20 minutes. David glanced across the hall at Liara, who had slumped down the wall. She didn't have 20 minutes. He could practically see the life draining from her as the air became toxic to her species. "I'm going in," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will die," Professor Helleth stated, as if it were a simple law of physics. "That's a parasitic fungus from a Class 9 death world. If you go in there without a suit, it's a guaranteed death sentence." But David was already fiddling with the door panel. His paramedic training had one absolute rule: don't become a casualty yourself. But watching Laura and the others gasping for air right in front of him completely changed the equation. "Override the lock," he ordered. "I don't have the authorization to—" "Professor," David cut in, "either you open this door or I'm about to make a new one through this wall. It's your call." Something in his voice, a quiet but absolute certainty, made her comply. The door hissed open, and David stepped into the chaos. The air felt completely wrong. It was thick with the smell of a damp, rotting forest. The temperature had plunged to a level that was likely fatal for most of the station's inhabitants. To David, though, it just felt like a crisp autumn morning back in New Jersey. He reached Ulrey first and checked for a pulse. It was faint and erratic, and her skin felt like ice. He gently scooped her up and carried her to a small alcove that looked a bit more protected. "Hang on," he whispered to her. "Just focus on breathing." Lara's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on him. "David, the spores. You're breathing them." "We can worry about me later," he said, already heading back into the hall to find more survivors. Bront was far too large to carry, but David managed to clear his airway and shift him into the recovery position. He spotted a small, crystal-based student whose body was beginning to crack from the extreme cold. Without a second thought, David shrugged off his jacket and carefully wrapped it around her, trying to insulate her. With every breath he took, the air felt heavier as alien spores tried to invade his lungs. But his immune system, honed by millennia of battling Earth's endless buffet of germs, immediately flagged the intruders as hostile and launched an all-out war. As his core body temperature began to rise, his defenses went into overdrive. The alien spores, which were evolved to thrive in the cooler internal temperatures of most other species, suddenly found themselves trapped inside a furnace. They began to cook and die off, but David was completely oblivious. He was too focused on triaging the victims, figuring out which of the fallen students needed his help the most. His long-dormant EMT training kicked in like muscle memory, a calm voice in his head cutting straight through the panic. Check the airway, listen for breathing, find a pulse. He moved with a clear purpose: stop the bleeding, treat for shock. When the hazmat team finally showed up, looking like giant marshmallows in their bulky suits, They found David kneeling beside a young alien girl, speaking to her in a soothing voice. "You're doing great," he said, his tone perfectly steady. "Help is here now. Just hold on for me, okay?" The hazmat team leader froze in his tracks, staring at this human, this completely unprotected human, working calmly in the middle of a deadly hot zone. David had been breathing this lethal air for over 10 minutes. He should have been on the floor with the rest of them. Instead, he was the one administering first aid. "Sir, you need to evacuate this area immediately." The team leader's voice crackled through his helmet speaker. "Almost done," David replied, not even looking up. "She's going to need an IV and a thermal blanket. That big guy over there is unconscious and needs a stretcher. The crystal student is stable, but I think she has some hairline fractures." The leader tried again. "Sir, you've been exposed to a Class 9 fungal agent." David finally glanced up at him. "Yeah, I got that. I'll get checked out as soon as everyone else is safe." That seemed to jolt the hazmat team into motion, and they started prepping the injured students for evacuation. David was the absolute last one out, taking one final scan of the area to make sure no one was left behind. In the medical bay, doctors swarmed him, running scans that left them utterly speechless. The spores in his lungs were completely obliterated, not just neutralized, but totally annihilated. His immune system had waged and won a silent, brutal war in a matter of minutes, and it took no prisoners. 3 days later, David stood before the Galactic Academy's board of directors. The chamber was massive, designed to accommodate 50 different alien species at once, and he felt like a bug under a microscope. He stood stiffly in his formal uniform as the board members examined him like he was some impossible puzzle. Chancellor Dreth, a wise ancient being whose crystalline body fractured the light into stunning rainbows, spoke first. "David Reed of Earth," his voice resonated through the hall. "You recently took our standard entrance exam, and you were also at the center of a major campus emergency. The board has reviewed the data from both events, and we have some questions for you." "I'll do my best to answer them, sir," David replied. Professor Heath then pulled up a hologram showing a clip from David's physical assessment. "During this portion of the test, you remained conscious in temperatures that incapacitated every other applicant," the professor pointed out. "How did you manage that?" David just shrugged. "Earth has some pretty hot deserts and jungles. I guess we're just built for it. We sweat to cool down. It works pretty well." "You leak fluid from your skin?" one board member asked, looking thoroughly disgusted. "Yep," David said. "Evaporative cooling. It's a neat little biological trick." The hologram switched to the low oxygen challenge. "Here, you continued to function in an atmosphere that should have caused you to lose consciousness. What is the normal oxygen percentage for your species?" "It's about 21% at sea level," David answered. "But we have cities built on high mountains where the air is really thin. Our bodies are just really good at adapting." Several board members began scribbling notes at a frantic pace. Chancellor Dreth spoke again. "During the pain tolerance assessment, you chose to proceed all the way to level 8. Most species lose consciousness at level 7. Why did you do that?" "Well, the instructions said that part was optional," David explained. "I figured the more data you had, the better, so I just kept hitting the button until it started to get a little uncomfortable." He paused for a moment, then asked, "Wait, was I not supposed to do that?" "No," Professor Heath said, her voice noticeably softer now. "It was just extremely unexpected." "How did your species become so resilient to pain?" another member inquired. David had to think about that for a second. "I guess it's just a part of life for us. I've broken bones playing sports, gotten cut up on the job, even twisted an ankle just taking a walk. Stuff happens. You learn to just power through it." A stunned, heavy silence fell over the room as the board members processed that. Finally, the chancellor brought up a file with a single word on it: Earth. Your planet is officially designated as a Class 12 death world. However, after reviewing all this new data, we've concluded that classification is dangerously inaccurate. David's stomach sank. This was it. They were kicking him out and probably blacklisting all humans from ever applying again. Earth, the Chancellor declared, is being reclassified as a Class 15 at a bare minimum. A prosecutor began listing the charges against his home world. Its gravity is crushing, its atmosphere is a toxic blend of gases, its weather patterns are a maelstrom of violent chaos. The native wildlife would be classified as biological weapons on almost any other civilized planet. And that's not even mentioning that the world is geologically unstable and constantly bathed in what should be lethal levels of solar radiation. Overwhelmed, David could only stand there in silence. "I guess it's not so bad once you get used to it," he finally managed to say. "You get used to it," one of the board members repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "So for a human, a Class 15 death world is just home." "Well, we've been living there for a pretty long time," David said. "A couple 100,000 years, give or take. We've sort of evolved to fit the environment." Chancellor Dreth leaned forward. "During the biocontainment failure, you were exposed to a pathogen with a 100% mortality rate. And yet you never showed a single symptom. Our medical scans indicate your immune system simply annihilated it. How do you explain that?" "Honestly, I have no idea," David admitted. "My body just handled it. I didn't even know I was sick." "You have an immune system that can defeat a top-tier bioweapon all by itself." David shuffled his feet nervously. "So, that's not something everybody can do?" "That is profoundly not normal," the Chancellor stated. "Most species here require a lifetime of immunizations and personal energy shields just to survive common Class 3 germs. You fought off a Class 9 pathogen while you were busy rescuing your classmates." "They needed help," David said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "When somebody's in trouble, you help them." The entire board was completely silent for a full minute. At last, a small insectoid member spoke up. "We also took the liberty of reviewing the data on the human's personal device. We discovered numerous images of a creature he calls a dog, which he apparently keeps as a pet." "Oh yeah, that's my dog. Hi, buddy. He's a golden retriever," David said, a huge smile spreading across his face. The board member continued. "Our records indicate that these dogs are the direct descendants of your planet's ancient apex predators, wolves. These creatures," an alien council member said, gesturing to a hologram of a golden retriever, "were once savage pack hunters capable of bringing down prey 10 times their own size." "Oh, you mean dogs?" David shrugged. "Yeah, but we domesticated them thousands of years ago. Now they're basically giant fluffy goofballs. We even call them man's best friend." The alien stared. "You pacified your planet's apex predators, and now you invite them into your homes for companionship?" "They're good boys," David said, feeling a strange need to defend the honor of every dog back on Earth. Another member brought up a different image from David's file. "And this ritual you refer to as rock climbing? It appears to show you scaling a sheer vertical cliff with no observable anti-gravity technology." "Oh, that's just a hobby. It's a super fun way to spend a weekend." "Fun," the alien repeated, the word sounding foreign and strange. "You willingly put yourself in a position of mortal peril for your own amusement." "Well, you're supposed to use ropes and stuff for safety," David clarified. "Most of the time." The entire room of aliens looked like they were about to have a collective brain aneurysm. Chancellor Dreth finally silenced the room, pulling up one last dossier. "This council was assembled to judge whether humanity is too great a menace to be granted admission to this academy." David felt his stomach drop. "Following an exhaustive review," the Chancellor's voice echoed, We have concluded that while you are undeniably a product of a terrifying world, you are not a threat. You are, in fact, the opposite. You are protectors. The unforgiving environment of Earth didn't forge a race of ruthless conquerors. It forged a race of survivors who learned that empathy and teamwork are the greatest survival strategies of all. He made eye contact with David. When faced with a simulated crisis, your first instinct wasn't to preserve yourself, but to rescue everyone else. It seems humanity was hammered in the forge not to be a weapon, but to be a shield. The wave of relief that hit David was almost overwhelming. For this reason, the Human Exchange Program is to be expanded, effective immediately. We are now formally requesting additional human candidates to join our emergency rescue divisions, our hazardous environment teams, and our deep space exploration fleets. Your species is simply too resilient and, frankly, too valuable for the galactic community to overlook for one more cycle. A little while later, Professor Healyth found him in the hallway. Your performance today has completely reshaped our understanding of your people. We once saw humans as monsters from a world of nightmares, the professor confessed. We could not have been more mistaken. You are guardians. David just smiled. We're just people, Professor. Our home world made us tough, but it also taught us that the most important thing you can ever do is look out for one another. That's the real lesson. That evening, he sent a video message home, doing his best to explain the insane week he'd had and how he somehow became the galaxy's new poster child for what it means to be human. Earth was, without a doubt, a tough place to come from, but you couldn't argue with the results. It had created something truly special.